In 1991, Mazda executives announced that they were creating the Amati brand, a luxury brand designed to go head-to-head with Lexus, Infiniti, Acura, and the best of the world. This was an ambitious plan by the number 4 automaker in Japan to raise their stakes, bump their sales up to number 3, and take on the world. And executives were, in their hubris, riding on the Miata effect, the belief that they could capture that lightning in a bottle. Just 14 months later, they canceled the project. 2 cars were nearly completed, a whole factory was set up, marketing materials were being created, and all of it was thrown in the trash. The 2 nearly completed cars were reconfigured, released as Mazdas in North America or other parts of the world, and to this day, Amati remains corporate shame that they don't want to talk about with the press. They don't even acknowledge it in their archives in California or their company museum. This to me is a story of what could have been with Lexus, Infiniti, Acura out there fighting the good fight in the luxury market, and of course Genesis Ascendant from Hyundai. What could Mazda have really done, and why did it all fall apart? So let's talk about it today. Alright, so welcome back. If this is your first time here to my channel, please click that subscribe button and be sure to give me a thumbs up. Really helps with the YouTube algorithm. But I have a personal story. Like many of the videos I do here, I have a personal story. And that is that I was going to do this video about the Mazda Millennia and what happened to it. It was sold between 1995 and 2002-ish here in America, and I never owned one. But I've driven several of them and I absolutely loved them. It is not an understatement to say that it is my favorite car of the 90s and one of the most memorable cars that I've ever driven, ever. So looking at the 90s, I was relatively fresh out of college, starting in my career, new wife, we were going to have a kid on the way. So buying a premium car, a luxury car at the top of the Mazda hierarchy, just was never quite in the cards for us. But I drove several and I absolutely loved it. It was smooth, powerful, refined, rode great. It was a marvelous car. And here we are over 20 years later and I still remember it. And that's what got me thinking about this video. But as I started to do more research on Amati, the brand that was supposed to be that luxury car division of Mazda, I became more and more fascinated, and that's where this video came from. A lot of what I'm referencing here comes from a Jalopnik article. I will link it below. I strongly suggest if you have an interest in this, go read it. It's more comprehensive than I'm going to get into here today. But the Amati story is executive hubris, a enthusiasm of the Japanese manufacturers of the late 80s, facing the realities of worldwide global commerce and a 2-decade-long recession. And I found it completely fascinating, and I can't help but think what could have been if Amati had actually launched. And I'm going to tell you that here at the end. And this all started in 1988, that Mazda wanted to see if they could launch a luxury brand like Lexus, Infiniti, and Acura. And they started Project Pegasus. Now, Mazda was the number 4 manufacturer in Japan, and they had a long-term goal of becoming number 3. And so they had started a massive expansion plan. They started several other brands like AutoZam and Infiniti, and these were all narrowly tailored, maybe mainstream but sporty or more luxury, and they decided they were going to launch Amati. And ultimately, people really didn't know if they could pull it off because they were such a small manufacturer relative to, say, Toyota and Nissan. But they believed they could do it. And the success of the Miata led them to believe that they could capture, like I said, that lightning in a bottle and make it special and make it succeed. Now, this story actually starts back at the early 80s. Now, as the United States came out of its gas crises and Japanese imports were ascendant, the Reagan administration went to Japan and the Japanese agreed to a voluntary restriction of imports. So what this did was put the Japanese manufacturers in the situation, right? The position of opening factories in America to produce their cheaper cars and start developing more luxury cars for the higher profit margins. So indirectly, the Reagan administration, if they didn't create it, they at least accelerated the influx of Infiniti, Lexus, Acura into the American market. While I can't get into it in this video, there was also some global currency concerns in the 80s, but suffice it to say that during the 80s, the Japanese had an almost unlimited supply of really cheap money. They could do almost anything they want to, and I found it very interesting to think that at the beginning of the 80s, Nissan, for example, offered cheap little cars, cheap little trucks. By the end of it, they offered the 300ZX, Nissan Pathfinder, the Maxima. You know, they had a whole line of cars, and the Japanese manufacturers were really pushing the boundaries. Mazda had gone into, I believe it was F1 and 1, and that was the late 80s, early 90s, and they developed all-wheel drive, four-wheel steering. Japanese were the first ones to put navigation in their cars. They felt they could do anything they wanted to because they had the funds to do it. And other businesses could get cheap money too, and when they couldn't expand their business, they put it in the stock market, which led to a big stock market increase as well. There was at one time an interesting article that said that Japan, actually the land of Japan, was valued higher than all of the land in the United States. That's how inflated this bubble was. So into this space, you've got tiny little Mazda who believed they could launch a whole new brand, and they challenged their US executives to figure out how to make it work. And they were against it. They didn't think Mazda had the ability and that Mazda didn't have the cachet to pull it off. But executives plowed ahead. And they started developing three cars, the Amati 300, the 500, and the 1000, to compete with the low, middle, and high of, say, Lexus and Infiniti. They took a whole factory and started upfitting it. They got to the point they were producing actual marketing materials. And then the wheels started to come off the bus. I'd like to say here real quick that one of the things they were doing was developing, allegedly, a V12 engine for the top line, the Amati 1000. So in early 92, everything started to collapse. All of that asset, all of that borrowing came to a halt. The stock market, I believe, decreased 70%. Companies started going bankrupt, and the companies that were healthy found themselves in a cash crunch. Little Mazda couldn't even support the products and the development for the lines that they had, much less launching Amati after all of the money they've put into it. And so the head of Amati here in the US told them they didn't even have the money to launch one of the products. So just 14 months after letting everybody know they were coming out with a luxury division, they pulled the plug. And as far as we can tell, literally they started pulling things up and throwing them in dumpsters. And the executives refused to even talk about it. It is described as, quote, a touchy subject for them. They don't acknowledge it at their company museum. There are no references to it in the company archives. They want it forgotten about because it's such a shame to them that they couldn't pull this off. But they had almost completed two cars. One of those would have been called the Amati 500, kind of the middle of the road here. And it was released in under a couple of different brands as the Unos or the Zidos 500 or the Zidos 6. And in America, it was called the Mazda Millennia. It took the top of the line of the Mazda lineup away from the 929 eventually, and between 1995 and 2002-ish, it was sold as a luxury car, or what we might call today a premium car. It had two different engine options, a 2.5 liter naturally aspirated, produced 170 horsepower, 160 foot-pounds of torque, and the top-of-the-line Millennia S had a 2.3 liter V6 with a Miller cycle engine, producing 210 horsepower, 210 foot-pounds of torque. And I've driven both of these. They were both amazing engines. So apparently what we saw here was heavily decontented, but it was still a fantastic car. They released several different advertisements for it, of course, on TV, trying to get sales up. I don't know how it ever ended up selling. I couldn't find any sales data on it, but it wasn't a big enough success that they replaced it, so eventually it just disappeared. The 929 had been canceled, but in other markets, while the Amati 1000 was never released, they believe they took a lot of it and repurposed it into what became known as the Mazda Sentia that launched in '95. And certainly it's big and stately, but that 12-cylinder kind of got forgotten. So during all of this, the program was canceled. They were kind of stumbling out the gate and releasing the Millennia. Ford ended up buying up 12% more of Mazda stock, raising their controlling interest to 36%, and they sent executives to try to return Mazda to profitability. Mazda went from being this freewheeling, we can do anything company to almost being a fiefdom of Ford, and really shrunk down the list of what products they had. You can see it here in this nice little image that somebody put together showing then and now of what was available. Mazda's never really recovered from it. To this day, they still end up remaining a bit player. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the data right here, they went from being the 4th to 6th in sales in Japan. I love the idea of what could have been because I am such a fan of the Millennia. And it is one of those cars that I would love to go back and buy one. But it is over 20 years old now. And do I really want a 20-year-old car that I'm not going to be able to get parts for? So I doubt I'll ever own one at this point. And that makes me extremely sad. I'm a big fan of Mazdas. If you've watched any of my videos, you know I had a Mazda Protege, and it was one of the best cars I've ever owned. So I'm a big fan of Mazdas. And I love the idea that what if that collapse, right? That lost decade didn't start for a year or two and Mazda had released it. What would have happened if they'd gotten the Millennia released and the Amati 1000 and the 300 and they were out there actually challenging Infiniti and Lexus? You know, I don't know, and we could argue about it one way or the other. Ultimately, I think it would have failed, and I'm afraid if they launched it, it would have dragged down the whole company to the point they did not recover. Lexus is established. Infiniti, you know, they are what they are. And while I love what we've seen, the hints of what Amati could be, it was a little understyled and a little bubbulous, but to drive them, they were fantastic. And you need a lot of money to keep that dealerships going and to keep new products coming. And whether that downturn happened when it did or 2 years later, they still would have been starved for cash and unable to support it, I truly believe. So I love the idea. I think we would live in a better world if Mazda had a luxury division out there slogging it out with everybody else. But it was not to be, and what we were left with was an amazing individual car here in America that was as nice as a Lexus ES, but thousands of dollars less. And it breaks my heart I've never owned one. So if you have a positive thought, if you have a memory of the Millennia, please share it below. I'd love to hear from you. But other than that, my heart breaks a little for this whole story, and I hope you enjoyed it.